It is a wonderful privilege to be with you, dear friends. And I come from Malaysia, and I've worked with BMS now. This is my 6th year, together with my dear colleague Tabia. It is a real privilege for us to be with you. And also Lon will be sharing during the second session today. She's from Singapore, I'm from Malaysia, and we work together. Lon worked with Luzon movement, and she's the editor for the Luzon Global Analysis, and she can tell us a bit more later. So, let's see. I've been given this topic in terms of mission in the times of change, and in the first session, we look at the mission-shaped church in times of change, and in the second session, we look at the global mission in the post-COVID context, and then the last session, bringing it together into what kind of mission spirituality that will sustain us as pastors, leaders in this context of change. So let me say that there are many ways to approach it, and I've suggested just briefly to introduce this context of change from a perspective of salvation history as a framework for mission in the times of change. If we could summarize it, the 21st century dawned with a dream of a new era of prosperity and blessing. Yet a little more than 20 years in these early centuries, we seem to be staggering from one crisis to another. And that is a sense that we live in terms of not just in the UK, but around the world, of this financial crisis. We term it here the cost of living crisis, but this is something that is happening around our world. This promise of prosperity for all have not really materialized. We just come out from a worldwide pandemic, and it's so lovely to be able to come together, isn't it? I mean, for that 2-3 years, it's like the whole time is compressed in this kind of local, global pandemic. And all our training for pastoral ministries were frozen. And we have to learn anew. How do we serve in a community that we can no longer meet? Almost like in a persecuted world. And there are many things that we could learn from the pandemic, and Lon would highlight that. We think of the culture wars that we serve today. We are no longer in a dominant narrative of a Christian narrative in these countries, Wales, where often that we are caught up in these culture wars, political upheavals, a growing militarism. In a sense, you think of the Ukraine war. No one could really imagine. It is exactly 1 year ago. And we all say wouldn't happen. And then war in Europe. It creates an atmosphere of fearfulness and uncertainty, including the environmental catastrophe. There are people who say that the greatest challenge facing humanity today could be that. So this discontinuous and unpredictable change is the order of the day. And the church is not immune from it. We live within these times of change. And I want to suggest this term salvation history as a framework for mission, where if we are to read in Genesis 1, a familiar text, first few verses in Genesis, and I'll read for us, that in the beginning God created the heavens and earth, which is a merism. Heaven and earth are statements of opposite, that says that in the totality of the universe, it introduced this person, God. And the summary of the earth's condition is that the earth is formless and empty, darkness was over it, the surface of the deep. Formless and empty speaks of judgment. Jeremiah in the Old Testament often, it says this formlessness speaks of chaos, of change, of crisis. And yet it introduced a creator God. So some people speculated, because of time we won't have to look at the biblical theology of evil and creation and recreation, is that in Ezekiel speaks about the fallen angel. That even from the beginning, we do not know where evil entered into the universe. And the challenge of war, making sense of sufferings, of bringing hope in times of crisis, is to be able to look at this salvation history, that this creator God, in that first act of creation, Genesis 1-3 speaks about emptiness and order, first day, second day, third day. It's from chaos to order. So God, in creating planet Earth within the universe, that only in the 21st century we are beginning to have a glimpse of the greatness, the vastness, the diversities of the universe. And the planet Earth, this act of creating the cosmos, not just a physical planet, but the humanity, the creation of humanity, is an act of mission, if you could say. And this is Bruce Walker who developed this salvation history, that the call of Abraham, the making of Israel, to be a blessing for the nation, is out of this chaos of the ancient Near Eastern world. That God calls Abraham and our Abraham, Israel, to be a showcase for all the nations to come and worship this Yahweh. So Genesis is really the making of a common people. Exodus and Leviticus is the making of a common constitution, values, and then they enter into the promised land in Numbers and Joshua. I think the point for this first slide is to remind us there is always a danger, and in reality, I think our brother reminded us, in times it's easy for us to go to one extreme or the other. Sometimes we are coming out of very difficult time, and we haven't really come out of COVID. In terms of there are many people who are still suffering the loss of COVID. On the other hand, we can go and like the penguin, jumping and ignore the realities of suffering. Theology and realities need to come together. But it's easy for us to be consumed by the winds of the earth. This is Leon Morris in his commentary. Looking at the making of the new church in Luke Acts, is to bring that together, that it is about God, the God of creation, is a God of mission. And in every generation, 50 years, 100 years, we are privileged to see that God is at work within the dirts, the frustrations, the imperfection of these times of change. And my prayer, in some ways, we have this framework. God didn't work just outside of history. He worked within the human history. And it is our privilege within the context of Wales to discern the signs of the time. And maybe to ask that big question, how is God building his church locally, nationally, regionally in Europe? What's the future of mission? But also globally. What is that lessons as we engage today that we can reflect together? So I'm mindful, of course, that I bring just a small perspective from the missional perspective. And during our group discussion, I hope there will be time for us after this Q&A, but also there will be dedicated time for us to say, what is the mission of a church within the context of Wales today? Mission is no longer out there, but now here. And I think Wales kind of lead is not the right word. You are grappling. You are not fighting against the reality that the church in Wales is in a missional context. Now, we work partly with the Baptist world family, and if we go to America, there is still a lot of confidence. But all the research are showing rapid decline of the church. And the church in America, North America, is trying to make sense of no longer at the center, where we no longer have the privilege. But I believe that often in the last few, maybe 10 years from what I've heard, you have been grappling with a mission-shaped church. And this is something that we have a contribution from Wales to our wider Western church. Another definition of mission-shaped church, I'm not reading the earlier and the second, is this excellent book by Barrett, Treasures in Clay Jars, Patterns in Missional Faithfulness. And sometimes our call is to be present, to be faithful in the midst of exiles. Our call is to offer hope of what it means to say, here is the Creator God who's actively at work in mission, that we are not in despair. That the church is a living between the gaps of the community and the congregational life. Traditionally, we train pastors, to be priests within the kingdom. But in reality, we all know that every pastor in Wales that seeks to come, whether from Korea or from Latin America, everybody want to reach Wales for Christ. Actually, they need to be untrained. They need to come to Wales and say that the challenge of living faithful life in the context of mission. What we learn in BMS, to send people where there is no church. All our training about ministering to the congregational life is no longer with us. And the church is to embody God's mission. So I think I want to say, first frame is salvation history. The wings of the earth, we need to discern our times. But it is the wings of God that is still at work. And it is wonderful. A time like this is a time for us to remind ourselves we are not alone serving within our pastorate. We are part of the Baptist family within Wales. And Wales, as we know, is unique from England. And Wales is different from other parts of Europe. But within these treasures of clays of jar, we can find hope if we begin to say there is a mission-shaped church. God, who is creating order out of chaos, is recreating his church within our context. So the mission of God becomes the centerpiece. We all participate in the mission of God. And God is still at work in history. That's the first frame. The second frame, maybe another perspective, is to realize that reality, it is not just the winds of God and say everything all well and good, but the reality of Wales today, even in the rural places, we do not escape from this term called globalization. Today, the world, everything that happens, whether it's in Ukraine, Turkey, earthquake, we experience it. But no matter what, we as a church want to build an underground railway to heaven. I'm on my way to heaven. Don't worry about the earth. We can't, because the people who come to church are seeking meaning in this context of the local and global. And the people within our context, our young people, they may grow up in the comfort of our churches. The moment they go to university, it has not prepared them to this new framework. So when we were working with young people in Asia, and I was surprised. We have like 15 different countries, young people coming together, and we say, how can we serve this younger generation? And one of the first things they say is, we need a Christian theology of globalization. Because out of the small towns in Bangladesh, in Nepal, they are all moving across, migrant everywhere. So this globalization is an important implication for us. It's not just for those who are serving in Cardiff or in churches in London, but every small town we live in this context of globalization. Implication for mission-shaped church. I need some help to go to the next. Yeah, so in summary, we may say a helpful way to look at globalization is not look at one framework, but that there are almost three pieces that are working together. Globalization leads to a global culture. Of course, we still have our local culture, but we are part of a global culture. Globalization has its own effect on the global economy. Whether we like it or not, we find that we live in a context beyond our local economy, and there is a global politics. And we won't go in great detail, but to say that the salvation history of a mission-shaped church happened within this context of a global world. I don't seem to be able to move to the next slide, if you can't. So, in a way, that part of the challenges for mission-shaped church is that we cannot preserve the old Christian culture because the society have moved on. We can manage it, we can make sense of it, but the church of the future increasingly has to reflect on both ends, both seeking to be pastor of our local congregation, but at the same time to prepare our young people to a changed world. And I think this is where all cultures, to some extent, are going through this modernization. Next slide then is we are saying that globalization is a process that leads to a new way of thinking, a new mindset. And not just a new way of thinking, they're just new realities. Thinking collectively. We can think as a Christian community within the church, but our lay people are aware of this collective thinking. Globalization leads to a new realities of multicultural awareness. And again, whether in a small town, there are migrants everywhere in our small towns. We think about mission those days are reaching the religionists out there in other nations. Today, in every small towns, there are Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists in our midst, even in North Wales, or you can think about other places. But increasingly, our young people, they all decide. I was just catching up with a few of you and saying your children, or they're now going to where? Other universities in England. This is just the reality of growing multicultural awareness. So the church, the missional church, need to offer hope and faithfulness in this new context. Even in Africa or Asia, the moment they have handphone, they are aware what they dream of Europe. Whatever we tell them, don't come to Europe, but the dream is to come to Europe. From Iran, from Iraq, or from Asia and Africa. Within BMS, we are trying to look at these people on the move. What's the impact of migration for churches in Europe? But one of globalism, is multiple perspectives. I mean, the moment we say this is the only perspective that stands, actually people know that situations are much more complex. Those religions are not just demonic and evil and no culture, but people experience the goodness of maybe the Buddhist spirituality. And they are questioning, especially young people. The fastest growing religion in universities in Europe has been Buddhism. Our young people who live within the church, and the moment they go out into the secular spheres, they have to engage with multiple perspectives. So is globalism good or bad for Christian mission? And this is the challenge that we have. Let's look at, again, a few going deep dive, so-called. We say, again, this global culture, it is really about people and objects on the move. And the church has an opportunity to say, what is the role of the Christian gospel in this context where there are competing truths, where there are different, the church has to be a church between the temple and the mosque. Even though if we may be living in a monocultural context in Wales, the reality is on the TV screen, our young people, they are aware of this multiple perspective. Consumerism, permeating all this. The context of mission of change is because of the communication revolution that is fueled by the rise of digital technology, which is redefining not just how we learned, redefining how we speak and with one another, and redefining how we form community. And this is, we were just talking about post-COVID. There are people who have experienced the online church. And we couldn't unwind the clock because there are those who demand that virtual Christianity. I have a Methodist church bishop from Singapore, and he was just joking with these young people because they are not coming back to church. Right? Because they experience online Christianity and they extol the virtues of online community. And this is how they think, building community. And he jokes, okay, if you want online community, I will give you online burial when you die. A virtual burial. And actually the reality is both ends, isn't it? If we just keep saying, get back to the good old days, but once they've experienced certain reality, how do we form the church within the global culture? Next slide. Is that previously we think about empires that controls the meta-narrative of our world. Today, there is both ends. Both westernization, there's a Korean, in Asia especially, the K-pop and the Bollywood are competing with the Western ideas. But actually, in North America, many young people are beginning to welcome this Asian pop culture. So next slide is to say that maybe we have to think about building the mission-shaped church as bridges for the gospel. We need to be able to have a commitment to gospel faithfulness on the one hand, but also to be aware of the winds of the earth. And even within the wider world, there are people who say we need to go back to a universal culture, but in reality, there's a hybrid. There is mixture. Or are we seeking to revalidate back to a particular local identity? So the church cannot be an underground railway to heaven. The church must regularly live out our faith with faithfulness within this context. We are going to just very quickly, without discussing them, but just to say that if we look at globalization, the unique ministry of the church is to pay attention to the world, the problems of the world. And next slides will show us on the global social problem. If you can say, the 5 big global social problems that we face in a mission-shaped church is the environmental issue, the population and migration, emergence of global cities everywhere, violence and crime. We think of whether it is hijack, drug, slavery, even the pandemic virus. It travels, and war, of course. Next slide. So the gospel that we seek to be a church in the context of a global poor is not only gospel poor, but people experience marginalization. And the church has something to offer if we are not only bringing the message of heaven, but that we are participating with this God who is paying attention to the pain of society. So just as the Genesis provided us with a picture of God bringing creation out of chaos, the next slide will show us just as an example where when the Apostle Paul brings back the themes of creation that awaits in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed, is that the creation that is groaning in this global problem. There are many young people who look at the world and say that the world is heading into an environmental disaster. And when they come to the church, maybe once a year, we bring that relevance of this ecological mission of a church into place. But we do not really know how to embody this global problem. When we think about the global problem of migration, young people are aware that migration is everywhere in our cities. But if the church does not reflect the reality of our communities, then there is a disconnect in terms of this globalism. There's a new way of forming community must involve the Muslims, the Buddhists, and the Hindus. And that is one example that we will have to say that we need to pay attention to be pastoral to our congregation. At the same time, salvation history, these winds of God, the Spirit of God is moving within a community that is no longer found within our church. So this is both and is always a challenge when we think about the gospel as healing for the nations. We must embody our mission that is in response to the deep pains of our local and global community. So the groaning church, not only so, but we are to identify with the groanings of creation, which I've summarized as the 5 big global social problems. And the church has this message. We are the first fruits, again, not underground railway to heaven, but we are to participate with the groaning creation. And when we do that, the Apostle Paul says that this God of creation, through his Spirit, leads us, even in our weakness, to encounter the Holy Spirit, who groans with the groans that words cannot express. So it's no longer for the missionaries to go out at the end of the world, but also to be here. Aware of a time that is quickly running out, let me show 2 last slides. And this is really to say that some people say the world of mission in the changing times, a helpful way is to think about what they call VUCA, or our world today is a world of volatility, a world of uncertainty, a world of complexity, and a world of ambiguity. Volatility about a situation that is unstable and unexpected for unknown duration. But it's not impossible to plan and understand. So as a union, there are certain trends that are clear to us, but the world is volatile. Uncertainty that despite of the lack of information, the event's basic cause and effect can be determined and change is possible. So for example, for the BMS World Mission, we believe there are a number of trends that we grapple with. One of that is that we were a sending mission in the past. All our over 200 years was sending British missionaries to go to the ends of the world. But today we find that the world that we are sending mission are where the thriving global Christianity. How do we see the future of BMS, where the Baptist Union of Wales, as well as the global Christianity, have a shared future? That is an example of uncertainty, and yet it is possible for us to discern the times. It is a world of complexity in the sense that situation has many interconnected and variable parts. And this is not just in society, but actually every local church. While it is a simple organization of worshippers, but the local church is far more complex than what we sometimes give it to be. There is a complexity because there is an interconnectedness of discipleship and variable parts. And it's for us to be exploring this. And it's a world of ambiguity in the sense that these relationships, or often the cause and effect, are not always clear. We face what we call the unknown of unknowns. So, and we experience it during COVID, isn't it? We need to plan this as a cause and effect, but we can't always be sure that if we do this, this is the outcome. So we will look at the next slide and says that the future for us within the mission in the times of change is to begin, part of it is to go back to the God of mission, to go back to the scriptures, and to follow the Spirit of God who's working in the world. But the wings of the earth are important for us. And we live in these new realities of VUCA. I'd like to close then by reading a summary of a mission-shaped church by Tim Keller, and I'll give you in the resources for your reference, is that the church has been given divine power to radiate the infinite glory and goodness of God in our lives and relationships. The church has capacity to be a new humanity, not the old humanity, but a new humanity, a community of surpassing beauty. Under the leadership of Christ's Spirit, churches have the ability to make their surrounding communities far better places to live, so that many are drawn to God's beautiful glory. May we worship the God of creation. May we worship this God of mission, who is not doing mission out in heaven, but inviting us to be a mission-shaped church in the context of change and challenges. Let us pray. Maybe again, let us spend a few moments to say, what are those factors that bring change and disruptions within our local communities? And today, to come and worship a God of creation out of chaos, a God of mission. That the church can be a pain-bearing community when we are willing to enter into the lives of the poor, the marginal, the sufferings. And within that context, offer a life-giving hope in challenging times. We ask and pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. I'm aware our time is up. We will have, do we have time for discussion? Yes. We do. A Q&A for 10, 15 minutes. Yes. Is that all right? So, and then later, there will also be a half an hour for small group discussion after launch session. But maybe we have gone through quite a lot in the framework of salvation history, but also the world of globalization and the challenges within Wales. And I'm aware that each of you are those treasures of, you see the unique context, and whatever you share will be something that we can all learn together. So maybe either a comment, there may be a theme that you like to explore further, and I'm not an expert here because there are many of you who knows the context better. Sorry. Yes, if we give, maybe we have, do we have 15 minutes?
Yes.
Yes. I'm conscious of the time. Simeon? Yes. Maybe some there's a lot that need to be unpacked and to discuss together.
Yeah. Thank you, Kang-San. That was great. You talked about how BMS is responding to some of these challenges. Clearly, for the church to respond to these challenges, it's costly, it's difficult,
Yes.
it's hard to transition to change.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about BMS's journey on that?
Yes.
And how, as an organisation, you've led and wrestled with those challenges that may encourage some of us here too as church leaders to embrace that challenge of what it means to be a missional church today. Thank you.
Thank you, Simeon. Yeah, I think we are two sides of the coin, isn't it? Because mission is no longer overseas, but here. Right? And what BMS, our advantage to me, BMS is a community of intentional disciples. We have an advantage that a local church may not have. Where people enlisted join with a specific shared focused mission. Right? So I do not in any way want to say what BMS is doing can be easily translated within the local church. But I think clearly we all face the same, some of these mega trends. Right? We face the decline of Christianity. We no longer have the resources from BMS to be going out and to bless the nations. But likewise, the local church in Wales, we realize actually we are in the missional context. So if we behave, our theology is about coming into the local church, actually the new reality is no longer there. People don't have a need to come to the church. We don't have the specialism of knowledge. Actually, we need to participate into the community. So I think for BMS is how do we the kind of no longer from here to there, but to be able to say the Spirit of God have moved outside from a Western mold of church. Part of globalization is not from here to there, but both ends. So we are seeking to say, how do we celebrate the diversities of God's Spirit working through multi-churches and ethnicity? So I think that could be one example. But as all of us know, I remember someone from Wales here a few years ago, and he, I won't mention too much of detail, was a missionary and then pastoring in the UK context. And actually, as a missional leader, you know that how do we bring the church from here to there? The future is there, all of us desire that, but we are caught with the here and now and seeking to do that. So I think often we say in BMS, it is a journey. It is not something that you can say linear, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, a kind of church growth strategy. Actually, we are participating with the Spirit of God. And so it is a pivoting change. So for example, we need to assure churches in the UK, that we are not abandoning our sending of missionaries. It is both and. But actually the future is that there are mission workers within the community. And I think for the local church is to be able to say that what is God doing in the community, what Tim Keller says, for the common good. And the church has a potential to join with others to seek to bring about the kingdom of God for the common good. And that is where mission makes sense. So I think about a taxi driver, a local Englishman, and I asked him, why are you not going to church? But he grew up in church as a young person. He said, I find it difficult to justify why churches exist if it doesn't bring a common good to the community. So that is one example. And yet, actually, when we join and bring the common good, we represent the gospel. It's not asking us to minimize our identity as a Christian. So there are many layers that BMS is grappling with, but I think they are parallel for the local church to respond. I know I'm not maybe giving great details, but maybe Raphael.
Thank you very much, Kang, and it was really interesting to listen to it. One of the global issues that you mentioned it was population and migration, and I'm guessing that when you talk about population, you are talking about population decline, and we are in a position here in the UK, and particularly in Wales, that population is declining is growing in age and declining in childbirth. Yeah. How do you see that trend affecting the churches, the local churches, and the global churches? Because we see in my local context, I buried 18 people in the last 3 years in a community of 70 people. It's a huge, challenge for all of us, but not just for us, but for the rest of the world. How do you see this sort of mission-shaped church working with older people? Because you mentioned a lot younger people, but actually we are actually working much more with the older people than with the younger people.
Yes, and it is a tension, isn't it? Again, part of the thinking is both. I think we need to be pastoral to our elderly congregation, such as even for BMS. Actually, the major support that BMS continue to receive are from faithful elderly people who were giving faithfully. And that is our core. But we all know that in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, if BMS does not pay attention to the future of younger generation and supporters, this is not just for money, but it's just the reality that in 10, 20, 30 years, we won't have BMS. Right? I think this is why I say the parallel for the church is that you face a fairly complex situation. Your primary call is for the local congregation, for the church, for the Christian. But the mission-shaped church says that with an eye for the future, then you need to disciple the next generation. And it is, again, is not an either or, isn't it? It is something that as pastors, you need to give time, but not to begin to think that your primary call is to be a pastor. A missional leader is seeking to reimagine the future of the church. And the future of the church is not just local, because you disciple young people, and they will go and be a blessing elsewhere. So it is not a church-centered leadership, but a mission-centered pastoral leadership, as an example, I think. Yeah. But maybe others can also comment. I'm just mindful that maybe what I shared may not be as fitting the local context. Yeah.
Hi, Kang-San. Thank you so much for what you shared. I found it very interesting, particularly with VUCA and that kind of business-driven understanding of the globalization of community. But the one thing I did notice from a sort of chaplaincy perspective is we come across people from all those different ranges of faiths and often mixed spirituality. But one key thing that we have found is that when they face significant life events, they really value the input from a Christian perspective, because some of that tradition, that marking of major life events is found to be too uncertain with a mixed spirituality. So bringing something of a traditional understanding can help them transition through those and build opportunity for the Christian message to be shared. Right. Just an observation.
It is. And that's why I say it's the bridges to the gospel. Right? We need to enter into a new framework of a postmodern or different faith, but we go there without compromising the value of the gospel, that the church has this capacity to blessings for the society, and they look for the certainties in the midst of uncertainties.
Thank you. Can I ask one question? Yeah, well, it's more a statement, I suppose. I'm an evangelist in this nation, English-Irish, but I'm converted to Welsh now, and been here 35 years out of the Baptist College, and I preach every week on Queen Street and University, and I was at a rugby match, met Bryn Terrell, and Mark Drayford got literature across them. What I find is that it's almost we've entered the Roman era again. I think that's where I think Christians aren't trained enough in apologetics. And I think we're very dumb about Islam, we're very dumb about Buddhism, very dumb about LGBT and confronting them. And there's a massive entourage against the church. And we're now about 0.1% Christian in Wales, which I think is awful according to records. But what I'm finding is the thing with all the changes and all the onslaught, the gospel hasn't changed, and the power of God, and we need to stand up as a church and open our mouths and our hearts and preach this gospel like crazy again into this nation. And my records are in my mind that for the 30,000 active believers in Wales, the 3.1 million, that would mean 80 people each to Christ to see the nation change. We need to pray for revival, but in the meantime, I really believe that our mission fields are here now, aren't they? Mm-hmm. They're surrounding us, the Buddhists. I can speak to a Satanist and a gay girl, a gay boy, an Islamic man within about 2 hours, 10 different confrontations on the street. Our mission, the earth, I think God has sent them to us now, amen, in Wales. And it's much cheaper than getting out on the mission field on the aeroplane. But I think that globalization is all around us, but the gospel hasn't changed, and that's so powerful, but we must speak out. And we've been quiet for too long, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So it is, if maybe for the sake of plugging a book, I have a book called Humble Confidence. How do we have confidence in the gospel, to be accountable to God, and yet enter into a spirit of humility, of mutual learning? If I'm a Buddhist, I'm Hindu, I'm Muslim, if you just tell me all that's wrong about my religion, I'm not going to come and hear the gospel. But I think what we are saying is this tension, that how do we maintain gospel faithfulness and certainty, and yet a genuine humility, a welcome. Part of the mission-shaped church, people say, is to discover hospitality. The church is a hospitable community where Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, LGBT could enter into the community and find a genuine welcome. And yet that welcome does not mean what our brother is reminding us, a compromise of the gospel. And I think the future, again, is an example. It is not either or. It is not just go on racing. We have been telling all that's wrong with others, but that has not brought them the bridges of the gospel. We need to reenact these bridges of the gospel in the context of Wales. Last question, I'm aware of our time, so a comment, or maybe a comment.
Kang-San, I think you may have just answered it, actually. So thank you very much. I love that. I'm going to hold on to VUCA and make sure that I don't forget that. But I guess my question, following on from the last gentleman's comment and also what you said, if we are expressing, I think what I'm hearing you say is that the church has to become a lot better at separating the gospel from its cultural trappings and expressing the core of the gospel in a volatile and uncertain and so on environment. So I think the reason the church gets nervous about that is because the church is worried, exactly as you say, about losing the gospel. So what advice can you give the church about how to separate what's absolutely core and key about the gospel from the way that it's expressed culturally?
Yeah. I think one for the missionary is to be able to say that it is not just the doctrine, isn't it, that brings transformation. You can have clear understanding of the gospel as a doctrine. People like us, we are attracted to the gospel because of relationship, right? And when you meet a Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim, now we as a Christian, our traditional apologetics, where we wrote this, IVP said there has been no book addressing apologetics with world religion because we are majoring on the doctrine, on the questions that an elite intellectuals in the West ask, and we bring apologetics to the whole religion. We have not paid attention to the Buddhists, the diversities. There are secular Buddhists, there are folk Buddhists, there are Buddhists who are like Cornelius, ready. But they know that if we have a package that we just preach to everybody the same, Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, as they are demonic or they have nothing to contribute, then they know that you have not really understood. You have not paid attention to the person. So in mission training, we always say that when you encounter a Buddhist or a Muslim, it's far more interesting than reading about Islam or Buddhism. And this is an opportunity for us. In Wales, you don't need to go out to the Muslim land. Every corner, you have a Muslim in the convenience store. Get to know them. Get to know what's their background, what are their hearts desire. And that is where the gospel can be a life and transformation experience for them. Okay, I should stop here. I think there will be time for us to discuss in small group later after session 2.